Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Yale Alumni Academy Climate Change Conversation Series. As all of the attendees begin to join us, we would like to give everyone an opportunity to introduce yourselves using the chat feature. Please tell us your name, where you're Zooming from, and what brings you here tonight. I'd also like to encourage all of you to chat with each other during the talk and make sure your settings are set to message everyone instead of only hosts and panelists so we can all join this evening's conversation together. Hi, we've got Ann Clark joining us from Carmel, California. She teaches food, agriculture, and environmental law. We have David, professor of music in Middle Tennessee. Good to see everyone this evening. We have Keith Nelson joining us from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Joelle Mona from Payson, Arizona, a town council member. That's wonderful. We have Charles Stebbins, Audubon Society Board from Fairfield, Connecticut. Welcome, Charles. We have Cassandra Locke joining from Seattle, Washington. She is the co-chair of their Environmental Sustainability Employee Resource Group. Jennifer Gammon from Miami, Florida is an entrepreneur focused on sustainable skincare. Lots of diversity in our audience tonight. That's really great to see. Bill Lynch from Seattle, Washington is interested in ensuring juvenile fish passage past any that remains. Shannon from Sacramento, California is involved in conservation, working lands, or building relationships with indigenous groups. All right, while you all continue introducing yourselves, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Professor Gerald Torres this evening. Gerald Torres is a professor of environmental justice at the Yale School of the Environment and a professor at the Yale Law School. He is former president of the Association of American Law Schools and has taught at Stanford Law School and Harvard Law School, where he served as the United Nations Visiting Professor of Law. Professor Torres served as counsel to the Attorney General on environmental matters and Indian affairs at the U.S. Department of Justice. He has served on the board of the Environmental Law Institute, the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and the National Petroleum Council. He is board chair of earthday.org and founding chairman of the Advancement Project, a leading civil rights advocacy organization. He is a trustee of the National Resources Defense Council. Professor Torres is also on the advisory council of the Connecticut Sea Grant and has served as a consultant to the United Nations on environmental matters and is a life member of the American Law Institute and the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, we will be discussing the problems of resource management facing tribes and indigenous people in the age of climate disruption. One of the signal events in federal resource management has been the active engagement of tribal nations in shared resource management. Whether this stems from treaty obligations or from the amount of public land within the ambit of tribal resource use, the new federal position has been to work cooperatively with tribal nations. The impact of anthropogenic climate disruptions raises new issues and challenges ranging from depleted water supplies to impacts on species important to tribal nations. How these conflicts will be resolved is unfolding in current policy initiatives. Recognizing indigenous knowledge as a critical component of resource use decision-making requires an appreciation for the depth of knowledge traditional approaches bring. And now I'll turn the discussion over to Professor Gerald Torres. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking at the names of the people who have signed up to listen. I'm a little intimidated. There's people out there who could obviously say more than I about this topic and other topics, and a number of them are old friends too. So now I feel kind of a special pressure. But in any event, what I'd like to do this afternoon, and I'll take 35, 45 minutes around there, and then I hope we have time for questions. But I want to talk about the problem or the issue of resource management, especially resource management over tribal lands, but over public lands in general, and the kinds of conflicts that arise, but also the ways in which at least the federal government currently is attempting to deal with some of the conflicts and to build out cooperative agreements. One of the key issues I want to focus on as we talk about co-management is the idea of managing for resilience as the tribes face the challenges of climate disruption and the pressure on the kinds of resources that tribes depend on, both for their livelihood, their economic life, but also of important cultural reasons for the preservation of some resources. I'm also going to focus a little bit on both kind of trying to define what natural resources are, the treaty and the statutory foundations for the obligations on the federal government, and then the difference between co-management and co-stewardship, because they sound quite similar, but they actually mean different things. All of these I want to frame within the broader idea of managing for sovereignty. That is to recognize that the tribal governments that the federal government is interacting with are sovereigns in their own right. They, have a kind of sovereignty that has evolved within the confines of federal Indian law, but in fact, one of the hallmarks of federal Indian law was the recognition at the beginning, all the way back to the beginning, the recognition that the tribes represented independent political nations. And so if you go back to the treaties that were made between the first European contact, the British, the French, just somewhat, and the Spanish, they all had different approaches. But what the British approach was to recognize that the tribes were in a position to be identified as co-sovereigns of the territory that they were occupying. It, of course, as you well know, led to enormous struggle. But it's a status that is at the core of the federal tribal relationship. In fact, most of the recent presidents have reconfirmed through executive orders or otherwise the government-to-government relationship that the federal government has with the tribes. And the Congress has recognized that as well in some of the statutes. So that when you think about resource management, I want you to obviously think about the kinds of resources, right? Land, water, animals. But I want you to think about it within the context of the political relationships that they represent, and the recognition by the federal government, especially the federal land managers, that they have a duty to enable the tribes to achieve the kind of sovereign control over the resources that they want to have, and in many cases ought to have. Now, having said that, I also want to make sure that I don't minimize the kinds of tensions that arise at the local level. Right? It's one thing to talk about this as though we're kind of abstract set of relations between the federal government and tribes, but they always take place, right, on the ground, right, in local communities, in rural communities, so that you often have conflicts between the local people on the ground, the tribal people on the ground, and you sometimes have conflicts between tribes over management of resources. But that conflict has also led to different kinds of political arrangements that I'll talk about in a little bit. So now I'm going to share my screen, and we'll walk through some of the issues that I've outlined. And I said I'd like to, talk for about 45 minutes and then leave some time at the end. So let's see if I can do this right. I hope I can. Okay. Did that work? I hope so. So I want to, frame this, as I've already said, right, within the context of climate disruption, because the basic tensions between land management as a form of political control is complicated by the continuing other burdens that climate change has generated. So this is what we'll do. We'll talk about natural resource management. We'll talk a little bit about the distinction between co-stewardship and co-management. And then I want to turn to Secretarial Order 3403, which was an order that was issued by the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture, in which they tried to identify all of the legal tools at their disposal that will assist them in working with tribes to manage the resources that are under control of either the Department of the Interior, Department of Agriculture, and to work out ways to build in the active engagement of the tribes. And then I'll turn to some case studies, because although I'm talking about kind of current efforts, and the more, what I will say, the more active engagement of the federal government, I also want to be clear that it's not a new thing, that tribes and states, tribes and the federal government, have recognized the obligation to manage resources, but it's not without tension, right? And it's not uniform. So the first place that the obligation or the responsibility for managing these resources in a cooperative way comes from is obviously treaties. So many of the treaties that the tribes entered into have explicit provisions for enabling the tribes to continue to use and thus manage resources that are traditional to the tribe and which made the economic kind of substructure of the tribe, but also, as I said, had often important cultural and often religious significance. One of the places where the kind of co-management has taken off in some ways arises in the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest, the tribes of the Pacific Northwest, or many of the tribes of the Pacific Northwest, are governed under a set of treaties that is often referred to as the Stevens Treaties. The Stevens Treaties explicitly reserve to the tribes access to the fish resource, and obviously the resources that are attendant to the maintenance of fish, both shellfish and bonefish. Right. So they are attendant to the kinds of obligations that are necessary to maintain access to those resources. One of the interesting things about the Stevens Treaties is that they, one, explicitly divided the resources in common between the tribes and the non-tribal inhabitants. And they also permitted the tribes to continue to access the usual places, even if they're off reservation, for hunting and fishing. And many of the treaties have explicit off-reservation agreements that permit tribes to hunt and fish in areas that are outside the reservation boundaries. And this issue has been litigated a number of times. It's gone all the way to the Supreme Court a couple of times. But the point is fairly well settled that the states cannot interfere with the arrangement that the tribes and the federal government reached when they signed these treaties, with some small exceptions. And the exceptions are where the state is acting explicitly to preserve the resource, to manage the resource, so that the resource will continue to be available. So there's the treaty foundation is absolutely critical. But of course, not all of the tribes are governed by treaties. And so many of the tribes have access to resources that are built on statutes or executive orders, or judicial recognition that they have a right to use some of the resources available to them. So when you look at who's involved, and the EPA, the state, the tribes, the private sector, right, and all of the federal agencies, right, but you also have kind of judicially created claims that the tribes exercise that continue to present difficulties. Just this last term in the Supreme Court, the Navajo tribe sued to intervene in an agreement that was distributing or dividing the water of the Colorado River between all of the potential claimants. The Navajo were making a very simple claim, and it derives from something called the Winters Doctrine. And the Winters Doctrine is a pretty simple idea. The idea is that when land has been reserved for tribes, or when the tribes have reserved land for their homelands, there has to be the water associated to make that land usable. That has to be part of the reserved rights. So what the Navajo were asking for was for the federal government to represent their interest, the tribe's interest, in the multi-state negotiation for the distribution of water. It was really just to get the federal government to both make a claim on behalf of the tribe and to get the amount of water that would be available to the tribe settled. Unfortunately, the way the Supreme Court viewed it was a little different, and it wasn't part of the complaint that the Navajo were raising, but Be that as it may, what the Supreme Court decided is that there wasn't a trust duty incumbent on the federal government to secure these resources for the tribe, because it would require the federal government to take affirmative steps to actually deliver the water. Of course, the tribe wasn't asking for that. The tribe was asking just for a claim to a percentage of the water. And Justice Gorsuch, in his dissent, recognized what the tribe was asking for, but unfortunately, his view did not carry the day. The reason I raised water before I go into other issues is because water, under the conditions of climate disruption, is going to be increasingly scarce. There are going to be many more demands, and the West, it still remains, and especially the Southwest, still remains the fastest growing part of the United States. So there's going to be additional non-tribal demands on water use. And so it does mean that the issue of conflict over water promises to continue to be a sore spot in the relations between tribes, the federal government, and non-tribal actors, state or private actors as well. So when the federal government initially proposed co-management agreements, what they did, as the slides suggests, right? What they did was to essentially bring to the agreement the preconceived notions of what management entailed. And what the tribes wanted to do was to say, you know, there are many ways to conceptualize management. And what we're going to start with is this idea of co-stewardship, so that the idea is you are stewarding the resource as opposed to managing it. So it's a way of thinking about the kinds of activities that you have to undertake that bring many different kinds of knowledge to bear on the management of those resources. And it also suggests that the tribes bring additional kinds of concerns that the federal land managers may not have had in their objectives and the missions that they were tasked with achieving, maintaining the vegetation, the wildlife, the fish, protection of some cultural resources as opposed to others. Well, what the tribes did was essentially open up that discussion, to suggest that the maintenance of the existing infrastructure has necessarily to include those kinds of things that the tribes themselves value, even where, right, the tribes don't have an ownership interest in the land, but have a deep cultural interest in the land. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to discussion of Bears Ears. Now, one of the things that the federal government is doing is that it doesn't just extend these cooperative agreements to federally recognized tribes. It has reached out and worked with some Native Hawaiian organizations to manage some of the federal territory in Hawaii that has implications for Native Hawaiian use and activity. So I've talked a little bit about this, right? That the tribes wanted to move away from the idea of co-management to get to kind of collaborative management and to co-stewardship. So they wanted initially, and here's the political dimension, right? They wanted not just to participate in identifying which resources ought to be managed, right? But that there should be kind of joint responsibility, and so the process of consultation, the process of identifying stakeholders, the process of taking into account different ideas of how things ought to be managed were critical in developing the idea of collaborative management or co-stewardship. And ultimately, in the joint agreement, the secretarial order between USDA and DOI, right, recognized that the effort has got to be one not just of management, but of stewardship. And so you get secretarial order 3404. And the first thing they did, and this is available now, you can I download it from the web. I should have had a link to allow you to download it. I apologize for that. But they already produced a legal review of all of the current treaty responsibilities and other authorities that support the secretarial order. And as you can see, the subject of the order is to fulfill the trust responsibility to Indian tribes in stewardship of federal lands and waters. So there are two elements in the subject line that are really important, right? One is the identification of a trust responsibility. That is, when there are resources that are in the control of the federal government, but in which the tribes have an interest, the federal government has a trust obligation, a trust responsibility to manage those resources consistent with the interest of the tribes. And second is the idea of stewardship, right? So that the Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Agriculture recognized both the trust duty and the movement towards stewardship as opposed to just a co-management. Now, I need to tell you that one of the issues that was just litigated in the Supreme Court when and it got a lot of discussion in the Arizona against Navajo case that I mentioned earlier, is what the nature of the trust responsibility is, and what the constitutional foundation is for maintaining a federal trust responsibility between the federal government and the tribes. It's important here to note that the foundational cases in federal Indian law establish a trust duty that is incumbent on the federal government when it manages resources that in which tribes have an interest, and when it has resources that are under its control, but which continue to have a kind of ownership interest or otherwise in the tribe, so that when the tribes ceded land to the federal government, and when they reserved to themselves some parts of that land, the question of control or early management of those resources fell on the federal government. But the federal government, in the so-called Marshall Trilogy, right, recognized that there was a trust duty on the federal government to manage these resources in the interests of the tribes. One of the, to me, concerning aspects of the Arizona against Navajo case recently decided was a concurrence by Justice Thomas, in which he mused about the foundation of the trust duty. And what he wanted to say, what he did say effectively, is that the trust duty is something that is, essentially made up, right? That the federal government may, through the Congress, legislates some responsibilities on the executive's part for management of these resources, but it wasn't a duty that arose out of the basic relationship between tribes and the federal government. That is, of course, that was just a concurrence. It wasn't the dominant majority opinion, but it does suggest that the idea of the trust responsibility, which virtually everyone thinks is both fundamental and firmly embedded in federal Indian law, may continue to be up for grabs. So, the Secretarial Order 3403 requires a consideration of tribal interests in federal land, water, wildlife management. It puts co-stewardship at the center and also empowers tribal stewardship over these resources, and requires, the Secretary requires the agencies under their control to report annually on the progress towards achieving the goals of the secretarial order. So there have to be intentional and meaningful consultations with the tribes well in advance of any decisions that will have an impact on tribal land or resources. If decisions are to impact tribes or the religious rights of tribes or the cultural interests of the tribes, the secretarial order asks that principles of implementation be consulted to and designed to achieve significant tribal input into the final decision. That means that the tribal proposals have to be given due weight in whatever decision-making process is constructed over any particular federal action, including the indigenous knowledge that the tribes bring, and to ensure that the treaties, any rights that are derived from the treaties, are not infringed, but in fact are supported. Because treaties are the supreme law of the land, and they remain enforceable on the executive until Congress abrogates the treaties, which it has the power to. But it is a foundational legal stone that does guide, or ought to guide, the relationship between tribes and the federal government and the agencies which have responsibility for managing the resources. Now, the Antiquities Act was passed largely to empower the president to preserve land, to take land essentially out of the public domain in a special way, to preserve it, largely because of what you see on the screen. The late 19th century was the period in which a lot of important archaeological sites, important sites that remain important to tribes were looted, desecrated, whole sites moved east and traded, right, including the remains of Native people who were buried at some of these sites, and were used basically as you know, specimens of study. That kind of that activity is what led the Congress to pass the Antiquities Act in 1906. What the history indicated, right, and the depredations that gave rise to the Antiquities Act showed, but is that there was a fundamental lack of knowledge about the land that the tribes occupied, the continuing interest in the land, even if it was outside the reservation, and the recognition that the federal agents responsible for managing this land themselves had a lack of knowledge and failed to consult with tribes as they made the land available to non-tribal members. So the Antiquities Act is critical because the Antiquities Act is the legal basis for the establishment of national monuments. So the as I said, go back for a minute, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about Bears Ears, because Bears Ears is in some ways a signal expression of this attempt to fully integrate tribes in the identification and management of national monument, and which permits the tribes to have input as the decisions about how this land is going to be managed, even where the tribes don't have quote ownership interest in the land. So Bears Ears, for example, there were 13 tribes that had Aboriginal interest in the land that was within the Bears Ears National Monument. And so one of the things the executive order did, establishing the Bears Ears Monument, was to design a mechanism for the tribes to both negotiate interests among themselves, but also then to engage the federal government in decision making about the land. Now, the climate change was included and mentioned in the executive order establishing Bears Ears, but it doesn't go farther than essentially mention it. It's obviously going to be an important issue, and it may rest more heavily, as I discussed earlier in the Navajo case, may rest more heavily on Native people. But I did suggest that the well, Bears Ears, and I'll end with Bears Ears, is probably the one that's kind of most well known. It's obviously not the first. So many of you, some of you may have been to Canyon de Chelly, or the Grand Portage National Monument, or Yukon Flats Wildlife Area. Right? Each of these areas represent natural areas where the Park Service or the BIA or the Fish and Wildlife Service have actively engaged tribes in the management of a resource area that's important to the tribe. So Canyon de Chelly is one of the most visited national monuments in the country. It's also one of the longest continually occupied places in North America. So the Navajo continue to have important interests in Canyon de Chelly, and they jointly manage it with the National Park Service, and have well, since 1934, I think is when it started. So Grand Portage National Monument was established in 1999, and the idea was to preserve this area, but because it also triggered a lot of non-Indian resistance, it's done on a basis that that permits continued review, and it's managed more on a contractual basis than actual honest to goodness coextensive management. Now, the Council of Athabascan Tribal Governments and Yukon Flats represents a different kind of management, because the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management and the Alaska Native Lands Act, right, created the federal authority to manage this land, but it didn't initially take into account all of the interests of the tribes that are in the area, so that the area of the Yukon Flats fish and wildlife area is critical, because it remains one of the most significant breeding grounds for waterfowl. And so the refuge, right, that was created initially by the Alaska Native Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, right, was further supported by the creation of this wildlife management area. So now we get to the area that's probably generated the most kind of popular discussion, but also was caught up in kind of vast conflict over the last few years. Right. So President Obama issued an executive order under the Antiquities Act, setting aside about almost 1.5 million acres, the Bears Ears National Monument. The area that he set aside was, as I said, important to 13 tribes, and it did they did create, in the process of deciding on a management model, right, to build a consultative process amongst the tribes. The tribes created the Bears Ears Intertribal Council, and then there was a cooperative agreement between the BLM, the Forest Service, the Hopi tribe, Navajo Nation, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, the Ute Indian tribe of Uinta Ure Reservation, and the Zuni Pueblo. They continue to exercise management authority, but one of the critical things that the executive order did when Obama first issued it was to create a process that required the Secretary of the Interior both to take seriously the interests of the tribes in the cooperative management of the national monument, but to treat the tribes as equals in that process. And even though the tribes don't have a veto over any particular decision, the executive order required the secretary to give a reasoned written response for a decision, which, well, we can disagree about the importance of having a reasoned response, making the secretary issue a something that can be contested, but has to be reasonable, right? What was important. Now, the president who succeeded Obama almost immediately restricted the size of Bears Ears. And he was, in some ways it's understandable, right? Because while there was a comprehensive process in establishing both the boundaries and the uses that the Bears Ears territory could be put, there remained, following the decision, parties that continued to object. So when you think about Bears Ears, you have you have all of these tribes, you have the federal agencies that regulate this land, you have private landowners, and you have the states, all of who are stakeholders. And it was the creation of a process that brought all of these stakeholders together that in some ways made Bears Ears special. The monument was restored to its former size in the Biden administration, and they continue to work cooperatively with the Bears Ears Commission to protect the important resources and values for which the monument was created. So if you look at the things that the Intertribal Council is doing, what you discover is, in fact, what they're ensuring is that not only will there be consensus for indigenous knowledge to be incorporated into practices, but there'll be active engagement of tribal members. And so the issues of the knowledge that the tribes bring that can be used to address issues of climate disruption are going to be integrated into the decision making. Now, what that finally will look like, it's not clear, right? But what's important is that the order establishing the monument recognized it and created a process for integrating both knowledge, but also for establishing a data collection and data sharing process that will build even additional knowledge that will enable this area to be managed taking into account the impact of climate change. So that if you think about the idea of managing for resilience, which is where I said I wanted to start, right? One of the things that that Bears Ears indicates, right, is that managing for resilience is part of the integration of tribes into the land management perspective. So the Hopi, for example, in Bears Ears, right, believe that it's critical to discuss climate change and its effect on the environment, because they believe, as most scientists do now, that climate change is caused by the cumulative effects of human misuse and neglect of the environment, and that land management practices, both within the Bears Ears National Monument and outside of the Bears Ears National Monument, are going to be critical, and they're directly related to the capacity of this land to be sustainable. So thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions. There, as I suggested at the beginning, this is a very complex set of issues. It brings both deeply cultural, religious, political, scientific issues all into play. And how, in my view, how the federal government manages these kinds of problems will be indicative of how they'll address other problems. And so it's not just that it will be meaningful for the tribes, right? It will be meaningful for how we are able to construct political organization that will actually solve problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Torres. That was wonderful. Our first question is from Valerie Norton, and she would like to know if Native Americans are allowed to hunt and fish on national park land.
It depends. The short answer is yes. Certainly national forest lands. The question is going to largely be decided by what treaty obligations the federal government has to guarantee. So as I said, right, one of the things that the federal government can do, right, is explicitly change the law. So like for instance, the Endangered Species Act, right, applies to tribes just like it applies to everyone else. And merely because there's a treaty to hunt specific kinds of species, if those species are protected under the Endangered Species Act, the Endangered Species Act actually prevents the enforcement, or it prevents that treaty right from being exercised.
Thank you. Our next question is from Jennifer Gammond. She says, do the treaties also address how to avoid tragedy of the commons, or is tragedy of the commons not as prevalent amongst tribes?
Well, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, there are many ways to think about the tragedy of the commons, right? So one thing you could say, right, is that, and here I'm going to take it outside of the treaty context for a minute, right? That one of the things when Bears Ears was created, one of the things that the federal government took seriously and tried to engage were the interests of all of the parties, and then the parties had to construct a technique, right, for managing their interests, even where they conflicted. So the treaties, I don't think the tragedy of the commons, the way that's commonly understood as a kind of an economic idea, applies to treaties broadly speaking. There might be a specific set of facts we could investigate where it might be true, but I think basically it doesn't apply. I mean, it's a heuristic that, you can ignore in this context.
Great, thank you for the clarification. Thomas Henry is saying, thank you for this informative introduction. Are there any co-management written agreements that can be viewed as an exemplar or starting point?
Well, you can go to the Bears Ears Intertribal Council and look at the agreement they have. Now, most of the tribes in the Pacific Northwest, the Stevens Treaties tribes, have co-management agreements with the state, right? So you can go and look at the agreements they've reached with the state. That's not the federal government, right? It's with the state, but recognizing that the resource conflict, right, becomes most acute on the ground, right? And so there's a number of examples that you can look at. The one I would point you to begin with is the Bears Ears. And the first thing I'd have you do is first go read the original executive order, because it does set a framework for imagining a different future of management.
Thank you very much. Ava Zegner is saying, I would love to better understand the native ways of knowing clause. What are examples of this knowledge and how is it put into practice in conservation and land stewardship? How does this knowledge differ from that of other parties or interests?
Well, I mean, two things. One is EPA has begun a project of identifying what used to be called traditional ecological knowledge, and asking questions about how that knowledge can be integrated in the management of a particular resource. So Lila June Johnston, you should look her up. She's fabulous, right? And if you read her dissertation, right, she goes through the kinds of things we can learn from indigenous management that when I read her work, I was, I learned a lot of things I didn't know. But let me just give you an example. So here at Yale, in the forest school, we are initiating a project with Salish Kootenai College, in which we're attempting to build in a course where the tribal forest management practices are integrated with non-tribal forest management practices, and to then assemble a set of protocols that lead us to think about how to manage the forest resource. The thing that's caught a lot of people's attention is fire management. The Yurok in California have a project, and there many tribes have suggested that the kind of the Western approach to fire management has in fact contributed to the kinds of horrific fires we've seen in the last few years, and that the knowledge about forest management and fire management ought to be revisited. The Lila June, who I just referred you to, it has a deep history of the way in which fire was used to maintain soil fertility, and she's done core samples and has generated the data. So there are things like that you can investigate, but there's not like an encyclopedia of indigenous knowledge, right? You've got to actually work with the people and figure out how they managed resources and what you can learn from it.
Thank you very much. Two people are asking questions along the lines of the trouble indigenous communities are facing throughout the world as their habitats are becoming continuously more encroached on, and how are these issues being addressed in the international forum, and are there any countries that are getting it right and kind of leading the charge, as it were, in these relationships?
Getting it right. I'd have to say that the efforts that the United States has made, that I tried to describe briefly on co-stewardship, right, is on the path towards getting it right. But you could look at something like New Zealand, where the Maori have a place in the national government, right, in the part of the essentially the Congress there, right, and where the government has recognized that some natural features have rights in themselves, and one of the ways you figure out what those interests are is to construct a process where Maori knowledge is brought to bear. So the other country that's doing similar things is Ecuador, and in Ecuador has declared itself kind of a multinational government, right? So there are many national interests within the state of Ecuador itself, and they've recognized an interest in the natural resources, and what they have to do is then devise a system for articulating those and then protecting them. So there's things like this are happening all over the country, all over the world, excuse me. And the UN has recognized it has a declaration on the rights of indigenous people. So it's just a declaration, right? But it's a start.
Thank you. Anne Clark is asking if you could touch on how tribes that are not federally or state recognized, or those that are landless, could advocate more effectively.
It's interesting because when I'm talking about tribes and in my discussion today, I was really talking mainly about federally recognized tribes. There's also a system of state recognized tribes, but there's one thing that being here in Connecticut, you realize is that there are a number of tribal groupings that have neither state nor or federal recognition. Creating a way for their voices to be integrated is important, but it's not as easy where they don't have a recognized political existence. So one of the processes, obviously, is to try to figure it out. I mean, one of their efforts in Maine and other parts of New England to create processes for non-recognized tribal people to be able to be integrated in land management issues. I forgot to mention the Penobscot in Maine, which just made the Penobscot River citizen of the tribe, and White Earth in Minnesota similarly. So it's just going to be harder where there's not recognition. But even the question of recognition is, of course, a loaded question, right? Because it's somebody who's asserting a superior power to say that you have political claims, which is, it's not unproblematic, let me put it that way.
Indeed. Can you discuss how social inequality with Native peoples has contributed to producing the Anthropocene, and whether addressing social inequality is helping address some of these issues?
Well, that's a big question, right? That's a big question. And there are many writers. Here I'm thinking of Ofemi Taiwo, who doesn't write about Native people, but writes about the kind of the process of colonial expansion historically. And one of his arguments is, he's got a number of quite subtle arguments, but one of his arguments is that it took the creation of the economic system that we currently have to produce both the positive and the negative effects we see, right? If we want to transform it, the project's just that big. right? And we shouldn't turn away from the project be that big, so that the many of the approaches to managing wildlife, managing forests that have been lost, undoubtedly contributed to I don't the Anthropocene. Although, you could say, you could also look at it from just a straight energy transition perspective, right? Moving from wood and water to coal to oil, right, is in fact the real process that you ought to be examining. So I don't know if there's a clear or simple answer to that question. It's a great question. It's huge. It's huge. And if the person who asked it, wants to participate in a much longer discussion, we can have that too.
Wonderful. Thank you. Eamon Duckworth is asking if you could speak on some examples of indigenous ecological knowledge being incorporated on non-federal lands and outside of federal trust obligations.
Well, just one place. Two examples. A land trust in the Pacific Northwest and a land trust in New England have both worked with Native people to incorporate management practices in the trust land, ultimately with an aim of the Native people essentially taking over the management of the land that's held in trust by the land trust, and perhaps ultimately being given back to those tribes. So there actually are a number of, at least those two big examples that I can think of just off the top of my head, where you have private actors working with it. The Nature Conservancy is attempting to integrate traditional and indigenous knowledge in some of its management. So the Nature Conservancy is a huge, land conservation group. You could look at the example of how they're managing their bison herds, and managing the bison herds not just for the bison, but because of the impact the bison have on the range and the biodiversity. So yes, there are examples of private actions. That actually, that's a good research topic, I guess. I better investigate.
You mentioning the bison and management of the range leads us to our next question. Does the U.S. have a legitimate current role in helping the Navajo Nation, among others, with overcoming the effects of overgrazing and overfarming, keeping in mind, the disastrous effects, dating back to the early 1900s?
The short answer is yes. Right. The short answer is yes. Right. The short answer is to the extent that the Navajo people want to work with the federal government on these issues. I think the federal government has in my view, right, a trust obligation to work with the Navajo. Are the people going to disagree with me? You bet. But part of it is what it's kind of asking yourself, what's the relationship, and what's the relationship you want there to be between the federal government, the state governments, and private people with Native people. I mean, one of the I'll just leave it there, because if we should imagine the kind of arrangements we want to have, and then ask, what are the steps that we need to take to get there? Which steps are mandated? Which steps can we take even if they're not mandated, right?
Thank you very much. We've got time for maybe two more questions. Ann Clark is asking, says some non-tribal organizations are undergoing truth-telling exercises to look back at the good and bad of past actions affecting tribes and develop land acknowledgement statements. But this may not be enough in going forward and may be causing consternation among tribes. What are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, means one thing people ask about what private activities taking place. One of the things it's come to my attention is kind of a voluntary tax that landowners have taken upon themselves to compensate the people who've been removed from the land. And that this kind of relates back to the earlier question about non-state or federally recognized tribes, because one of the things, at least some of the people I've talked to, recognize that the indigenous people, the native people who were the inhabitants of that land, aren't recognized as tribal units, but what this voluntary tax system that they're creating is a way to help compensate those native people for the loss they've suffered. That's one thing I know about. I'm not sure if that was very helpful, but it was certainly, you ask, what are private people doing? That's kind of one of the things they're doing.
Thank you. And our last question for this evening will be from Lauren Summers. She asks, climate change is predicted to generate conflict amongst regional groups as competition for resources and land becomes affected by climate migration and other kinds of scarcity. How does that competition affect collaboration between indigenous groups and governments?
Well, I mean, it's going to increase competition for resources generally. So one of the things I was going to talk about, but I didn't, right? I talked about the water conflicts. Right? Well, one of the things that's important to recognize is that the resources that are necessary for say batteries, which are going to be a necessary component for storing electricity, a lot of that's found in native lands, right? So, the one question is: are we going to ask tribes to continue to sacrifice for purposes of that energy transition, or put another way, it should be a decision that's left to the tribes, and they may want to do it, they may not, right? But globally, and here the global issue is, of course, intense, right? Because when you look at the projections for climate migration, the number of people who are going to be moving around the globe is going to create it's going to create a number of problems, right? And some of which we're seeing already today, right? So I think they're going to there will be competition among groups, but there are always going to be competition among groups for resources, and it's going to be exacerbated by climate disruption.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm not sure that was a terrible answer, and I recognize it, but
well, it's complicated, and
it's very complicated.
I think the overwhelming point is that it's about healing relationships as a foundation, and when we heal the relationships, we can have open conversations about these issues, and that's one of the reasons why it's important to the Yale Alumni Academy to hold these discussions as a forum, for these ideas and for these important conversations. I would like to thank everyone who joined us tonight for being here on a Friday evening and for submitting your questions and joining the discussion. And I would like to thank Professor Gerald Torres for his wonderful and insightful conversation. Several of you asked about some of the readings that were referenced. I will collaborate with Professor Torres to accumulate a list for you that will be made available on our website in the coming days. Professor Torres, would you like to tell everybody about the upcoming educational programs that you're involved with at the School of the Environment, if they want to learn more?
Yeah, no, absolutely no. First of all, I will happily work with you to generate, a reading list.
Wonderful.
One of the great things that we've managed to pull together here is in a great expansion of the number of Indian related courses. So we have 3 courses in the law school, and we're going to have 3 courses in the school environment. One, which is ongoing. One is the one I described with the forest school, with looking at ways, and I'm not going to try to name it because it has a better name than this, but it's incorporating indigenous knowledge in forest management as people get trained to be foresters. So that's one. There's a tribal co-management clinic that we offer, and the co-management clinic works with tribal groups across the country, and the students then do clinical work. I teach the federal Indian law. There's an advanced federal Indian law, and then there's another course called, Indigenous self-governance in the American Constitutional Order. So we're trying to do all of that, and we recognize that they're both having the school, the environment, and the law school both doing it is really important, because they the different disciplines teach you different things, but they have to be in conversation. So thank you.
Those sound very exciting. We will provide information about those on the Alumni Academy website as well.
Will do.
On behalf of the Yale Alumni Academy, I'd like to thank all of you again for joining our climate change conversation this evening. And I would like to remind everyone that the conversations will continue Monday and Tuesday of next week at the same time. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.